Hi, everyone. It's Deb Blum here, and I am so excited that I've got my friend and a colleague, Jai Flicker. Hey, Jai.
Hi there.
So great to have you on. It's a little bit of a fun little reconnection. Jai and I are podcast co-hosts for the Parenting 3.0 show, and I'll make sure I put that in the show notes. And the Parenting 3.0 show is a little bit on hold right now, so there's not any new content. But I was thinking about something the other day, and I was thinking, we managed to get in our first season some of the most important components out there. So I hope
Yeah,
people continue to watch it, listen to it, because it's truly got every most important thing any parent needs to know, in my opinion.
yeah. Well, we really focused on laying the foundation, the sort of theoretical foundation and the conceptual foundation, all the principles that we've used to build our practices, our respective practices. So it's very rich with good information and anecdotes and stories. So I think I really am pleased with the work we did for season one there.
Yeah, and maybe someday we'll jump back on again. What we were doing was recording in person. So this is our first time ever. Well, actually, one time we did record something over Zoom, but pretty much this is the first time that we've actually done a recording over Zoom. So it's different
Yeah,
for us,
yeah.
but
And
fun.
just a quick note: we were in the process of recording season two, and even had two or three episodes under our belts when things changed, and so
Yeah.
then it was a little hard to know exactly what to do, and we kind of put it on pause for the time being.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and not to mention the fact that, I mean, one thing I'll just call out is that you're one of the people who is dealing with the challenge of being a working parent, two working parents at home with a 2.5-year-old. So that's a
Yeah,
contributing factor. So
yeah,
carving out time to be able to do something like that on a regular basis would be challenging. So that's okay. And we have a great, I mean, listen, there's so much information for people to listen to out there right now that probably just having 15 episodes on one podcast and being able to consider yourself to have accomplished that would be awesome for people, you know?
yeah, yeah.
So anyway, so Jai, but before we actually dive into anything, maybe you could share a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what, yeah, just, a little bit about
Sure.
LifeWorks.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, so I'm an educator. I work mostly with teens. I've been at it for over 2 decades, and I'm also the founder of a, what I often call a tutoring center called LifeWorks Learning Center. But the reason I pause is because we really do more than just tutoring. We kind of blend, on the one hand, tutoring, which is really more focused on academic support, with coaching, which is really more about organization and time management and attitude. And then with a third thing, which I usually call mentoring, because there's a sort of social emotional element to it, a more personal element to it, a more relational element to it, that when put together really makes for a richer experience, and I think leads to better outcomes. So that's what we do at LifeWorks, and that's how our teams, and we work in terms of the content. We do mostly high school across the board. Now we're also doing middle school, and all subjects and test prep and AP exams and college essays, kind of the whole shebang. We try to be a one-stop shop for parents and students.
Yeah, that's cool. And, up until the coronavirus, you always did everything you did in person. You had two
Yeah,
offices, you have two offices, Mill Valley and in Corte Madera, but that obviously changed and you haven't been able to do that. So what's very cool about this is, in some ways, this is like the public announcement of that you're doing this for anyone, any
that's
any
true. Yeah,
anywhere, I should say, anywhere, that you no longer are inhibited by proximity. And so
yeah,
people can be getting on and kids can be on Zoom calls with you or your tutors, mentors. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
How has that been going for you guys? How's that, now that you've been through a little bit of a transition?
It's been going fine. I wasn't sure how the work would translate because it is so individual and so personal and so relational. And what I found is, as soon as there's a little bit of a adjustment period to just being virtual, and then once the conversation starts to go, the medium disappears and the conversation just comes to the forefront. And so it's been great. I mean, I've been having amazing conversations and sessions with students. It's been awesome.
That's so great. I'm so glad. I expected that that would happen, but I also knew that it is new for people. So, it's good to hear that it's going well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
So I think that I have just will say, speaking from personal experience, but also knowing so many parents of teens who have gone through working with LifeWorks and working specifically with you, that what I have observed is that you really are a unique model. It's really unique, and that sometimes people don't know. Like it's a kind of a joke that people will say things like, I don't know what happens at LifeWorks, but it works and it's good. And so we're just going to keep going there. It's like a secret sauce, that that you guys have. And I now understand it much better, having gotten to know you so well and, through our podcast. So I really understand it now. But I think what's really fascinating is that it isn't, it's not as secretive as it seems. You can actually share it.
Oh yeah.
There are
Yeah.
actually elements that you consciously have thought about and researched and practiced and experimented with to get to this place where you really know how to be effective in getting kids to not only get better grades, but also connect more with the material and feel good about themselves while they're doing it. And that's not an easy thing to do. Getting teenagers more engaged in their work and getting better grades, that's hard, because it's not like the kids coming to you are consistently the kids who are just doing great. Sometimes they are. So here's the big question. What is it? Like, what do you do? Like, can you share with us what it is that you do?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, part of the reason that the secret sauce remains somewhat secret is because it's kind of a lot. It's not so
Mm-hmm.
much secretive, it's more like deep and broad. And so there's a lot to it. And to try to explain it, I mean, like to to even begin to really do a thorough investigation of it took 15 episodes of a podcast, for
Yeah.
example. And obviously you can condense it, and I don't mean to make it, I don't mean to be hyperbolic here, but the reality is that, um, as you well know, a big part of what holds kids back in school has to do with motivation. And so that's not really, this is why it's helpful to have these three buckets of sort of tutoring, coaching, and mentoring. And motivation has a lot more to do with coaching and mentoring than it does tutoring, right?
Yeah.
It's not so much about the content. And there's such an emphasis placed on the content, understandably, that motivation gets overlooked a lot. And we have such a generally poor understanding, such a caricature of what motivation
Mm.
is, that teachers and parents and educators more broadly tend to sort of struggle to help teens get engaged, like you were saying. So basically, if we first of all see the student not just as a student but as a person, that's obviously helpful, because nobody wants to be related to as their role, purely as their role. People want to be related to as themselves, who happen to have some responsibilities towards school, for example. So, but if I come in and I'm just trying to just explain some concepts, um, it overlooks the fact that, hey, this is a person I'm dealing with. We're actually in a relationship. And so I want to like attend to that relationship in a conscious and an intentional way. And that there's a lot of really good reasons why kids are resistant to school, and helping them get unstuck in those ways makes a huge difference. Instead of the more common thing, unfortunately, is just to blame the kids, like, oh, you, and just to label them as
Yeah.
lazy, basically. So I don't know, that's kind of a lot, but that's even just scratching the surface. That's sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of what makes, I think, LifeWorks different and the LifeWorks approach different.
Yeah. Well, it's, from what I know of it, yes, you focus on the underlying reasons why someone's not getting their work done, not just labeling them or making assumptions. And you also don't just power through. You're not just like, listen, we're here to get your work done, and you just got to get your work done. And when you're done, then you're done. Like, that's not how you handle it. Like, you and your tutors and mentors are looking for, well, wait, what's the reason why they're not motivated to do their work right now? Or one of the other things I think you do that so beautifully is that you're always looking for what else is going on emotionally, socially, psychologically, that needs to sort of be worked through before they can get to the place where they can be ready to do their work. That's one. And second, I think I'd love for you to talk about, you touched on this part about relationships, that people want to be um, related to beyond their role. So it's not just like, I'm a student and you're a teacher and that's what we do, is this role thing, that they really want to be related to. And it goes to what you and I both totally believe in, which is that kids are going to be more willing to do things when they feel connected to the person. So that's an important piece. So when the tutor spends time to understand what's going on in the kid's life and what has them not feeling motivated, or what has them feeling a little bummed that day, or has them feeling a little bit like over energized or something, when they spend that time, not only do they allow that student to have time to process it, but they also connect with them, which sets them
Yeah.
up.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. I mean, there's kind of a lot in there, because on the one hand, if you start to get to know a student in terms of, hey, what are your interests? It shows that you care. It shows that you care and that you're interested in them as a person. And so that's positive. And that's one of the ways that you can build relationships, is to genuinely be interested in wanting to get to know someone, beyond just the transactional sort of practical task at hand.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. And then, but there's also a part of it where, kids see, learning is a much more vulnerable process than most people realize. And I think it's kind of, if I was not a, if I was not an educator myself, if I was focused, if I was just a parent and working in some other field, I could imagine being sort of annoyed that at the prospect of learning being so vulnerable, because there's a certain temptation towards impatience where it's like, just get over it. This is not that big of a deal. But you can't really, from one perspective, that's true, but it doesn't really, that's not a helpful perspective. It doesn't lead to good outcomes. It leads kids to sort of clam up and shut down. So, for me, being in with these kids, day in and day out, year in and year out, it's kind of like I've had to surrender to what actually works. I've had to, accept, it's not so much like what I want to be effective, what I think kids should do. It's like what actually works. You kind of I would go out of business if I didn't, you know. So there's all sorts of pressures to do that. And also obviously like you want to be effective, you know, you want to be helpful. It's like a waste of time otherwise. So realizing like how sensitive kids are, I mean, I'm just like, oh, well, that's the reality of the situation. It's such a vulnerable um, process. And as soon as somebody starts to feel defensive, they just shut down. And and especially if there's any sort of history, which there's always a history with parents in particular, that it's like, so it's like a hair trigger. And so this is why sometimes it's helpful to have a third party person come in kind of with a clean slate, who is, you know, not as involved and invested in and intermingled in the family dynamics, et cetera. It's sort of easier, but it's certainly not impossible. And I think it's really positive for parents to be involved in this way. It's just accepting that it's a very sensitive, vulnerable process, and creating an environment of psychological safety makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, it makes such a big difference, and it makes a big difference for all of us, right? It's not just our kids, it's everyone. We all want that. We're all much more sensitive than I think we like to admit.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, well, let's talk a little bit though. You talked about the part of parents, that parents are, you know, it's good for parents to be involved, but I also think that we've talked often about how it can also be hard to have parents involved, and how sometimes having parents involved, as you said, they're like highly invested, but also there's a way that we can thwart our kids' autonomy. And so how do you guys factor that in as you're working with your students? And also, you know, how do parents get it wrong?
Great question. I mean, autonomy is such an important uh, psychological need to understand. And you know, we talk a lot about it on the podcast, so that could be a good resource. But in short, it's autonomy has to do with feeling a sense of ownership of your own life. And so the opposite of feeling autonomous is feeling controlled. And so, you know, in the interest of helping our kids be safe and kind of do the right thing, we as parents often will get involved in controlling ways, and it's counterproductive basically. So I think the concept of counterwill is one of the most helpful and sort of clear ways of thinking about it. Counterwill is an instinct it's a self-preservation instinct that kicks in anytime we're feeling controlled or coerced. And you know, one evolutionary use of it is that if a child meets an adult that's not the person that's supposed to be kind of raising them and leading them, and they say, hey, do this, the counterwill kicks in and goes, don't tell me what to do. Like, so counterwill occurs both in response to controlling behavior, but it also occurs when the attachment connection, when the relationship is not well established, or the dynamics is not in place in a good way. So if, you know, obviously parents have a long history with their kids, but if the dynamic is off, and then the parent tells the kid to do something, that's when the counterwill comes in. Whereas if you attend to the relationship and get the dynamic right, then they're going to be much more cooperative, and less resistant. So I think that's the big challenge, and there's obviously a lot to that. But basically what we do, and what I recommend parents do, is we let the students feel the ownership and the responsibility for their own schooling. So I'll do a lot of questioning around what they're wanting to do, and part of what so for example, I will start a session and say, so what do you have going on right now? What's on your mind? And just leave it very open-ended and let them populate the to-do list, and I'll help them sort of sort through it. But I don't co-opt that process, because then it feels like they're a passive observer to their own education. And yeah, so I think I'll just say one more thing on this for now, and then it's the mistake that I see parents make most often is when parents get more worried about school than the kids are, or more invested in the outcome than the kids are. And all of a sudden that it's like, if the parents care more about school than the kid, that's a recipe for disaster. And there's a way in which that over caring actually crowds out the caring of the child. So it's sort of paradoxical, where if you kind of really step back and are sort of not attached to the outcome, and you go, hey, this is your life. I mean, you want to just sort of, not care about it, then the part of the student that does care is much more likely to come out and go, but oh wait, actually no, I don't know if I want to like completely ruin my whole future here. I mean, no kid wants to ruin their future. So I think one thing that has taken some time for me to see is like kids, almost all students really do want to do well, and trusting that and like drawing that out of them is really helpful. I mean, that the word education itself is related to the word educe. It means to draw something out. So this distinction between drawing something out, educating, and instructing, which is sort of to put something in, it's a very helpful distinction. It's like, hey, sometimes there's missing information, and when there's missing information, to instruct someone is really helpful. But much more often than not, what's needed is this educing out, this drawing out of what's there. And that shift in perspective makes a big difference in terms of what the emphasis is, what we spend our time doing.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, it really is something that's so interconnected, what you're doing with your students. It is, I really love that you have it in these three categories of the part where you're talking about, like, where you think you might actually need to teach them something. So that's the tutoring. And then there's also the part where you're trying to draw it out from them. But then the glue is really this relational piece of it for you, right? The mentorship, the connection that you have with them, the environment that you create from which they can learn, rather than, just sort of assuming that they're just going to be ready to go. You guys don't make that assumption. You really do know that you need to connect first. I mean, there's the phrase that is with younger kids, which is like, connect before you correct.
Yeah.
And really it's sort of like, connect before you learn, connect before you pretty much anything. Like, you'll always do better when you connect first.
Yeah. And and another word for connection, because it is attunement. It's a slightly different emphasis, right? To attune to someone is a little bit different than to connect with them. And I think I actually got this. I mean, I'd heard of attunement before, but I really got how important it is from Dr. Jeremy Jensen, the psychologist I did, who works with kids at LifeWorks, and we did a webinar together. And he was explaining, like, attunement is when you sort of tune into the person and feel into what their needs are. And so it's a little bit different than just connecting, even though I use that all the time. It's like, hey, let's make sure we connect first. But like, if someone comes in and they're frustrated, they're going to need something different than if they're sad, or if they're really excited. And so they're just kind of, their attention is elsewhere. And so being really highly attuned to what the individual we're working with is going through and experiencing is very helpful.
Yeah, well, it seems like one of the differentiating factors there is maybe connection feels like there's like inequality, and it's just like, oh, we're just going to connect. And not that there isn't value in connecting over like
Yeah.
the football, game this weekend or whatever. There's real value in that, but there is a difference of you holding yourself in a position of that you're caring for this person, you're caring for their growth and you're caring for their learning, and that it's you who is attuning to them. The connection doesn't come from them attuning to you. I mean, that might happen too, but that's not what you're creating. You're taking responsibility for attuning to them so that you can really meet them where they are. Yeah. Hmm.
So an example is like if a student or a kid is really involved in some activity, and we just come in and say, "Hey, it's time for homework." That's not very attuned to where their mind is, where their attention is. So we would want to see that and go, hey, like they're super involved in something. Let's come in more gently and kind of like help redirect over a little bit longer period of time. That would be a more attuned way of helping a student or a child transition, just for example, right? So
Mhm.
so being, again, this kind of comes back to what I was saying before. There's a way in which we can sort of want our kids to be a certain way. We can want ourselves to be a certain way, but we have to, in order to be effective, we have to always start with what's really real. We have to start with where we actually are. And we have to start with where our kids actually are. You can't, if you're trying to get to point C and you're at point A, but you really wish you were already at point B, and so you give directions from point B to C, it's going to be the wrong directions.
Mm.
You have to go all the way back to point A and say, okay, you're at point A. We both probably wish you were at least at point B, but oh well. So how do we get from A to B? Let's go there first. And once we're at B, then I'll give you those directions. I'm eager to give you the directions from B to C so you can get to the end goal, but we got to get to B first.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it is so easy. I'm with you. Like there's a lot of wishing things were a certain way and not really just acknowledging the truth of what's really going on. And it really helps me to understand some of the things that you've learned over the years, and it makes me even have more faith than I've had tons of faith and confidence in our podcast, but even more that in this conversation, just because I'm feeling into for you that like, God, yeah, you really did have this science experiment going on. Like, how can I keep on doing better? How can I understand them better? How can I be more effective? And that's most of us, like from a parenting perspective, we're just doing this with one, two, three, four kids or something like that. And that's about all our experiences, and you just have like hundreds of kids coming through and you're able to keep practicing. So it really just adds more validity to the depth of the things that we've covered in the podcast. So anyone who wants to learn more about what Jai's talking about, and because this is all applicable to parenting, like every single piece here is applicable to parenting. I mean, perhaps you're not doing, like I don't do a lot in the academic space with my kids, but all of the mentor coaching pieces are 100% relevant
Absolutely.
to
And
parenting.
during the shelter in place, stay at home time, more parents are being called upon to step in a tutoring capacity. So I think it's more relevant than normal.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I feel like the attunement piece thing, I want to just I want to just like echo something with that, because I do think that that's a really important piece for parents to take away from this, of how when our kids are doing something and like we notice that they're not doing what we wish they were doing, It is so fascinating. When my kids were younger and they would be on devices, they'd be on, their Nintendo DS or something like that, or an iPad. That was when they were a little bit older. My kids are 16 and 17. Um, they would be sitting there so consumed by whatever they were doing. And what did I do in the beginning was I'd walk in and be like, all right, time to wrap up, you know, or I then got a little bit better. My next step was like, oh, I'll give you warnings. But neither one of those things worked fully, because what they both of them were was just, me expecting them to have the capacity to be able to just end something like that they were so engrossed in, transition to what I wanted with like no, oh, there's going to be nothing, that just they're going to be fine. Thanks, mom. Thanks for helping me out with that. There was none of that happening. They were always resistant until I learned how to go over and to sit next to them. So if I wanted them to be done in 5 minutes, I knew 5 minutes, before that, like I'd go sit next to them, and then I'd start to say like, oh, so what is it that you're looking at? Like, what is that? Hey, just want to let you know that is your video coming to an end soon? Because it's time to wrap up. And I'm doing this in this way that I'm connecting with them. And then by the time that they actually are done with that show, they're back into the human world they felt connected to. They know what the expectation is next. And so I think about that as it relates to school. A lot of times that's what parents are fighting up against, is their kids on technology. Right now they're doing something, they're watching a video, and the parents going, God, this kid really needs to be doing their work. They haven't done anything. Like, I know that they haven't done anything. And so the invitation to attune to the kids first, and to start to try to understand what they're going through. Like, hey, like, is it possible you're feeling a little procrastination around doing your work? What's going on there? Like, is it feeling like it's too hard for you? We talk about this in some of our podcasts about trying to, as you said, ask questions. Is there anything I can do to support you in it? Questions to kind of, invite them to talk more than just saying, you got to get your work done. This is what you got to do. Get it done
Well,
by
yeah,
5 o'clock.
yeah. There's an aspect here of sort of whether we as parents are sort of going to be perceived as sort of adversarial, where we're an outside force saying, hey, you do what you're supposed to do, versus more of an ally who's stepping in and saying, hey, like, I mean, most of the kids, when they talk about being on their phones or on their computers for hours and hours, they don't say it with pride. They say it with like embarrassment. They're like, I was on TikTok for 5 hours. Oh my God. It's like they're not happy about that. So it's not like they're meaning to do that in a sense. It's sort of like, there's some sort of compulsion to just be distracted in a time where there's a lot of stress and there's a lot of loneliness, going around, because they're not able to see their friends or even their relatives, their family outside of their maybe immediate home. And a lot of uncertainty, and so there's a lot going on. So people are coping. They're not consciously choosing to just be digitally distracted. So to understand that, and the solution is not to tell them the right thing to do, but to help them get their needs met that they're trying to get met through some other means. So basically, the more we understand that mostly what kids need from parents is to feel cared for and taken care of and supported, more than they need guidance around school. If they're struggling to get motivated, instead of just telling them what to do, we come in and we connect with them, and we, like you did with your example of sitting down and asking, getting curious about what they're up to and getting a sense of what, where they are. It's like that's giving them fuel to actually do the right thing. It's a bit more of a indirect approach, but the more kids feel, even at the teen level, the more they're feeling like really supported and connected and attuned to and taken care of, the more they can kind of, they get this energy that's needed to make mature decisions for themselves, and the more likely they will do that.
Yeah, I mean, I just love that you brought this up about the kids coping and that they do need. So there are several things in what you said. First, I'll say the part about the coping. I think we all are. And it's so easy as parents to not even be acknowledging our own struggles in this time, to not even acknowledge our own struggles. And so therefore it's hard for us to acknowledge theirs. And I was listening to someone on a podcast that I'll put in the show notes. It was my friend Louise Clark's podcast about parents struggling with that their kids are just hiding out in their rooms. And it's been our experience too, that our kids are often in their rooms for hours and hours and hours. And it was, there's some real just truth to like that. It's easier to get your work done when it's, you're in your room. And like, I know my son's on like talking while he's doing his work with his friends, and, there's a lot going on. But she also really brought awareness to that they are going through so much right now, that they're grieving the loss of their lives as it was. They're missing their friends, as you said. They don't know what the future is going to hold for them. I have a senior and he doesn't know if he's going to college. That was his plan. He doesn't know if he's going away to college in the fall, or is he going to be home, or is he going to do a gap year, and what's available to us. It's just everyone is sitting in such a place of unknown. So this attunement really is such a magical tool for people to say, what if I just slowed down a little bit and I just watched and just cared about the possibility that I know I just saw, did someone just walk by behind me?
There was a squirrel on your fence.
Oh, it was a squirrel. I saw something. But people it's easy when we're stressed out to forget about that. But it's like, if I think at the core of all of us feeling better in this time is to feel more connected, not just for our kids to feel more connected, but for us to feel more connected to them, for us to feel connected with the other people that we're in a germ circle with, and so if we can slow it down, watch what's going on with them, and then meet them where they are, and acknowledge like, hey, maybe even owning like, hey, I notice that I have been, eating more sweets lately, or I noticed that I've been on Facebook more and it's hard for me to get off. I wonder if I'm like, trying to fill some type of connection need while I'm on Facebook. Are you noticing you're more pulled to social media these days? What's going on with you? And try to open up that conversation with them and help them to see that, maybe we're all just sort of coping with what's going on, and try to understand what's going on with them a little bit more, because that will fill that cup for them. Their attachment needs will get met, but ours will too, because we'll feel more connected to them as well. And so I just really appreciated you raising that part about what our kids are going through. It's got to be hard for us. We at least have a little bit of context in life. We've lived long enough that we might and it's hard for us, but for them, this is like a rug got pulled out from underneath them unexpectedly, and their whole lives just went, they like got thrown up into the air, and they came slamming down, and they're trying to wake up from like figuring out what the heck just happened and what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah. It's really unprecedented, and it's sort of as the initial kind of shock of the school closures has sort of settled in, and it's like, okay, well, this is the rest of the school year at least, and as at least in our district, as they went to the pass fail, and giving everyone who kind of completes their work reasonably A's, which I think is helpful, to take some of that stress off, especially since the instruction and the classes have been so kind of all over the place. It's a huge adjustment, and but there's a way in which, as we've settled in, I think there could be a tendency to kind of go, okay, well, now we're used to it. We're more used to it. It's still, there's all these questions about the future, but we're sort of in somewhat of a new holding pattern or routine. And I think we can very easily overlook just how unsettling this whole thing is, certainly for ourselves, and for our kids. Yeah. I mean, I think, like, for really little kids, like for my 2.5-year-old, this hasn't been particularly unsettling. I think it's been way more unsettling for my wife and I, but and so she's picked up on that, whether consciously or subconsciously. Of course, if we're more stressed out, it's going to affect her. But I think on balance, the increased amount of contact and time spent has more than made up for the increased levels of kind of chaos or stress or whatever we're going through. So I think for her, it's been a net positive, but when I'm talking with my high school kids, especially juniors who are trying to make sense of the college application process, I mean, like, nobody knows what to do, really. There's sort of better ideas and some strategies of like, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But it's like, what does this all mean? And nobody really knows. And so to just have to face such an uncertain future is just no generation has had to face that particular kind of uncertainty in recent memory.
Mm-hmm.
So I said this to a student. I said, we've kind of been fortunate in this part of the world, at least, to live in this fairly stable, relatively peaceful environment. And so all of a sudden, for this level of disruption to occur is just, we're kind of all taken aback. No, we're not used to it.
Yeah. And I was listening to Gordon Neufeld's Parenting in the Pandemic video, which I will also put in the show notes because that was so good. And, he talked about how what happens is that when we end up in a place like this, kind of like a crisis, I guess that's what you would call it, a crisis, what happens is our bodies are having all kinds of emotions. Things are happening. We're experiencing stress, and maybe our heart rate is faster, or we're feeling some like sadness in our being, but we don't necessarily have access to the feelings and the words and the descriptions. So and that, he was saying, was actually a survival mechanism, that when, like, if you're in war or something like that, you have to sort of shut down a little bit of access to those feelings. It doesn't mean they're not happening. You just shut off access to it so that you can be in like the alert mode that you need to be in to, like, to do what you need to do. And so what he's saying is that that's actually happening to us, to kids and to parents right now, is that we're a little bit in this mode of, how can we keep ourselves safe? What do we need to do? How do we need to take care of things? And because of that, we're not really tapping into what's going on inside of us, the stress that we're experiencing. So sometimes we're just numbly going through life, and we are just going on social media, or we're drinking, or we're, whatever our ways of coping. And so he talked about the need for us to engage in more connection and play, and to bring more, to be doing things with our kids that allow them to express. And, maybe it's music, or maybe it's, it's creating a video or something, but allowing them to express themselves in other ways, because it's actually the way to act out in a positive way the feelings that we're experiencing in our bodies. So yeah, just
I love
important
that.
to,
Yeah.
yeah, important to acknowledge that that's all happening. Like, even if you feel like you're good, you're like, we're doing good. Our family's pretty good. There's stuff happening that you're probably not feeling. He had like an iceberg and he said, like, all these things are happening, but whether you're actually seeing them, is a different question.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for me, I mean, I think the grief one is really important because, and it has hit me in little mini waves where I'll be just going along and then something will happen. Yesterday, I saw a video. It was like 2 minutes long and it was about this small town where one of my extended relatives lives. And it was just like all these shots of like an entire Midwestern suburban town, like residential and downtown, all these shots of it just empty. And it
Mm.
was like this really lovely music, and it showed the high school, and and parking lots just empty. And then it showed all these homes with people's windows, and like people had put up signs, and like kids had
Mm.
painted rainbows and like said, hey, like hang in there, and all these positive things. And I'm getting choked up
I
just
know, I
reading
get goosebumps from it.
and it was and I just was like, it reminded me kind of like what we're all going through. It's so crazy, it's hard to kind of process. It's so crazy. And in my immediate surrounding, I don't, because we're trying to really not go out a lot, so I'm not seeing those empty parking lots, even though I know they're kind of happening. So to see it and go, my goodness, this is just nuts. I mean, I was thinking, if you kind of pitched a movie, you're like, okay, imagine like there's this like virus. It's a deadly virus. It's an outbreak, and it's so deadly. Like everyone has to just stay home. Like nobody can leave their homes, and everyone's just like in their homes, and like businesses have to shut down and stuff. You're like, that doesn't even seem like, you're like, come on, that's so exaggerated, and yet
Yeah.
that's literally our situation. So it's sort of hard to wrap our heads around for ourselves and for our kids,
Yeah.
right? and
Yep.
and 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 I've said this before, but early on, one of my students said to me, she said she was just kind of wrestling with it. She said, I've never lived through a pandemic before.
Mm.
And the comment, I was like, me neither, but the comment kind of implied to me that it was almost like she didn't realize how unprecedented this is for everyone,
Mm.
and creating space for us to be people first. I mean, this is why
Mm.
that principle comes in such handy. It's like in the before times when kids would come into LifeWorks, starting out with just a check-in, hey, how's it going? And was always important, because some days there wasn't much going on and they just wanted to get down to business, and that was totally fine. But other days, by doing that, we, it would make room for some really important stuff to get addressed and attended to first. And right now, I think that's even more important than ever for the reasons we're discussing, right? It's
Yeah.
just it's such a big, uncertain situation.
That's what's kind of cool, is that you've been doing that anyway. Like, those are things you've been doing. These are things that you've been supporting kids. I mean, everybody, I just feel like it's been amplified. I think all of us have always needed a lot more connection than we probably get, a lot more attunement than we usually get. We probably need a lot more of someone understanding why we're not motivated to do what we do better. It's been always there and ever present, but it's amplified in this time. And I'm curious, what else what else are you seeing? Let's think about the kids that you're actually working with right now.
Yeah.
What are the typical things that you are seeing with them?
Um, well, basically, I would sort of break it down into two categories. There's kids who, and I think this is a sort of amplification of what we already were seeing. There's sort of kids who struggle with organization. And so being, at home, trying to navigate online learning is extra hard for them. And motivation is extra hard for them. I think that's kind of across the board, but it's, if you already had sort of challenges with motivation and then have this on top of it, it's that much harder. So, and these things kind of intermingle. So it's like, sometimes it's hard to tell if they're having trouble kind of tracking it all, if it's more of an executive functioning challenge, or if it's a more motivational where they're just like, this is too, like, I can't be bothered with this. Like, and there's, this feels so pointless, and especially with everything going on. So it can be that. So that's one sort of side of the coin. And the other side of the coin are kids who are both motivated and able to navigate the new environment, the new online environment. And they tend to be finding, like, they get their schoolwork done within a certain amount of time, and then they have all this extra time where they can't go hang out with friends. They don't have extracurriculars, at least in the same way. And I think they're sort of wondering what to even do with themselves. And so for those kids, I've been focusing more on the idea of being more intentional with their time, right? So the kids who are struggling to just navigate the system, or to, just to keep up with work, they need more kind of, in the trenches, sitting next to them and kind of, stepping through the process, and
Right.
and it's sort of more basic in a sense. But the kids who are kind of doing it, they need more help finding meaning. And so what I've been talking with them, I've been pulling this book off my shelf. I'll just show it. I haven't read this in a long time, but this is William Damon is a Stanford psychology professor, and he that whole book is saying that if you look at kids, if you they did a longitudinal study, and you look at kids and see how, like, what were some of the best predictors of future success. One of them, and he's saying the main one, I don't know, that's a little bit strong, but let's just say one of the most important is this idea of having a sense of purpose. Now, it's not, when I've mentioned that, sometimes people are like, oh, how am I supposed to find my life purpose? And it's not like a unitary ultimate realization of purpose. It's more of just like something that's meaningful, a project or a direction that's meaningful. And so I've been telling a lot of my students, I said, look, you have all this time on your hands, and normally your time is so filled by school and homework and extracurriculars that you don't even have to think about it. If you're just going to be reactive and responsive to the demands being placed on you. And when all these demands get lifted, or many of them, we kind of don't even know what to do with ourselves. I said, this is an opportunity to start to be more intentional about how you spend your time. Like, what do you want to do? There's obviously limitations here. You can't just go anywhere you want, but we have more access to the entire world virtually than we've ever had before. So you can learn about anything you want. You can start to acquire pretty much any skill you want. You could read any book you want online. I mean, there's a lot of potential here for growth and exploration. And I had one student, every time I think about it, it warms my heart. She said practically she wanted to start journaling more. And then the larger intention, she said, yeah, I'm usually so outwardly focused on school and sports and extracurriculars, et cetera. She said, I want to use this time to just get in touch with my inner self.
Wow.
So I was like, yes, because that is a great use of time, right? Instead of just passing the time. Not that there's anything, I mean, it's to be expected that kids are going to spend more time on, Instagram or TikTok or whatever their digital distraction is,
Video
but
games.
or video games. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. But if in addition to that, they're also spending more time getting in touch with their inner selves, that's going to be a really positive thing for them. And it's going to make this time more meaningful as opposed to just, uncomfortable and sort of weird.
Yeah. And when a child is getting the support from you about purpose and meaning, what was the thing that got them to come to you in the first place? Were the parents saying, hey, listen, my kid's,
That
he's
student was
just
an ACT prep student.
got it. Got it. So it's like they come in and they're doing one thing, and then it's expanding into these other conversations with them.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, that's part of what I realized very early on is that if I'm hired as a tutor and then I branch out into something that has to do more with mentoring, that's sort of like we didn't necessarily agree to that. And I had a situation where a student came in, she was like really upset about something that happened at school. So she was there to get help with math, and then she broke down in tears, and I ended up talking to her for, half the session at least about whatever happened and supporting her. That was much more of a mentoring uh, move there. And at the end of the session, when I was writing up my notes to send to the parents to let them know how it went, I was like, oh man, we didn't get very much math done. And but yet when I told them what happened, they were super grateful. They were like, oh my gosh, she felt so much better. That was so great that you did that. So I felt good about what I was doing. I felt like that was the right thing. The student was so, felt so supported and happy, was in such a better space, and the parents were happy, and yet I still had this uneasiness. And I realized that it was because it just wasn't made explicit on the front end. So that's the thing, as I said, I got to just put this on the table and say, hey, we have this blended approach, and we're going to go to these different places, and sometimes it's going to be mostly tutoring, but sometimes we are going to go to these other things when needed. And I kind of I'm going to use my professional judgment on when to go where. And it's and it it's helpful because I got onto the session with the student about presumably about ACT prep, and yet we both were like, first of all, the one she was planning on taking was already postponed, and we were both kind of thinking the one in June that she signed up for is likely to get postponed.
Yeah.
So then it's like, well, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
And so there was a natural reevaluation that was called for, and it led to this really great conversation that at the end I could tell she was feeling very, she expressed, she thanked me like 4 times, you know what I mean? So I could tell she got more out of it than she even was hoping for.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's just one example, but it's I think it's representative of the kinds of interactions that happen and that are possible when you come at this with a larger frame.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, totally. Like my kids both went to you for specific things around writing a thesis, but yet they got so much more out of the conversations that they had with you. I, always felt like they were kind of life-changing conversations that they had, not because the content mattered. The content did matter, but being in conversation with another person who really, like, your depth of curiosity and your desire to understand them and to help them to understand content and to weave it all together in this way, and then to help them to really see the connection to, like, why knowing how to write a thesis is important, not just for your, English class, but for life. And, it's knowing that even as the parent, is helpful for me in my life. It's changed the way that I look at things, you know. And I also would say one other thing is that your reports that you do after, I mean, people love them. Parents will tell me, they'll be like, oh my gosh, I got this report after, and it was the most information I knew about my child in years. So they love that aspect of it. So, you know, I know we've all appreciated that piece of it. um
Yeah.
there was something I wanted to, oh, I
Well,
wanted.
one thing about the thesis, because I think if I were just listening to this, I'd be like, okay, great, a thesis statement, right? But I'll give the example, a very quick one, to hopefully bring that to life a little bit more. As we've talked about, what I tell kids, and I first of all tell them, hey, I didn't know this all through high school. I didn't learn this till I got to college, and I fortunately had this grad student who was my TA pull me aside and share this with me, and it was like this light bulb that went off for me, and so now I pass it on to kids, and that is that a thesis is really supposed to be the one big idea that your entire paper is about, right? so basically in high school they teach where to put the thesis. They teach structure. They say, okay, so almost every high schooler I know can say, yeah, well, it's supposed to be an introduction, and at the end of the introduction comes your thesis, and then are your 3 body paragraphs, and then a conclusion. So they know the structure of an essay, and it's helpful to know that because that's a useful structure. But nobody knows that I talk to until I say this, that the whole essay is supposed to be about communicating one idea, one big idea, and that your thesis statement is where you state it most clearly. And once they get that, they go, oh, I mean, that was my experience as a freshman in college. I was like, oh, it finally makes sense. And so then there's a lot more ability to sort of marshal one's mental faculties in the direction of like communicating this one idea, and that every one of those body paragraphs is there to like help support that one big idea. To go for year after year hearing about, okay, what's your thesis statement, and have a fuzzy idea, kind of a vague sense of like what it is, and to be able to sort of define it but not really know, and then it leaves kids kind of going like, okay, wow, 3 to 4 pages, that's a lot of fluff that I got to come up with.
Right.
And that is such a waste of time, and it's kind of a painful thing of like trying to just fill space, as opposed to going, what do I think about this? Oh, and why? And let me articulate that. I mean, that's such a more useful activity or undertaking.
Well, and more fun and more enjoyable. There's so much more to it. My kids are so much better writers because of that. You know, and it was a funny thing because I think you're the one that identified that Jake didn't know. I think that's what happened. He went in because he was getting some support around maybe AP Euro or something like that. And then when he was with you, you identified it and then helped him. And then I then subsequently brought Josh in to say, okay, well, they both need this lesson. And I knew that I wouldn't do it any justice to do it. You know, I was learning as much as they were learning when you were teaching. So it's one of the things I just want to point out that I love that LifeWorks does is you're so customized to the student. And I love that I think you've always brought this in, but I'm loving that you're emphasizing some things around purpose and meaning. Because I see it too, like with my kids, these opportunities to not just be in a holding pattern, but to actually see this as there's opportunities and what possibilities are available. And maybe even, yeah, we don't really know what's going to happen in the future, you know, post coronavirus, post, you know, education being disrupted. And so, you know, some kids might make choices. I mean, I'm not speaking for my kids. They're not speaking to this, but I sometimes look at my my sophomore, and I'm like, no, does he really need to go back? Should he just get his GED and then like start college at, the community college? Like, I've thought about it just because it just seems, it kind of got like school felt a little bit less critical in some ways to me. And so when we start to have those questions, we've got to imagine the kids are having these questions, and then where can we get creative with them? And I just like that you're offering kids spaces to be able to ask themselves questions, to not, I've always known that you did a beautiful job at bringing more meaning to what they were learning and connecting it to their lives more. But I love that you're also trying to be more like looking at the more existential questions of like, who am I and what do I want to do in this world in this lifetime? And I'm excited about that. I'm inspired that you're doing that. I bet you a lot of parents would like to work with you on that for their own lives. So, all right. So what I want to bring this to a close with the final, probably super duper important question that a lot of parents are wondering. You have weaved in so many great things for what parents can be doing, but I would love for you to just bring attention to the couple of things that you're seeing, that parents can really like seize the moment around right now and harness, or not only that, practical things that you're like, hey, this is what the kids are needing. Here's my, advice for you.
I mean, we've talked a little bit about relatedness and connection, right? And attunement. That's sort of one fundamental human need. And then there's this need for autonomy, which we talked about. And there's a third need. This is coming, as you know, from self-determination theory. And we talked a lot about that. We did a 4-part special on that in our season 1 podcast. The third need is competence. And so feeling good at things is part of that. But the original word, and this is how I've been making sense of it for myself and for others, the original word that they use in the literature was not competence, it was effectance. And it was basically saying, can I have an effect on my surroundings and on my environment? Because if you think about it evolutionarily, if we're not able to kind of affect our environment, we're just going to be at the mercy of it. And there's a way in which living through a pandemic where there's a tendency to kind of feel like we're at the mercy of just what's going to happen, right? And so there needs to be this countervailing force of affecting our environments. And that's a little bit, it's in some ways it's harder, in some ways it's easier because it's just going to be different than before because our environments have shrunk down in some senses to our homes. And so I think for me, I've spent so much more time just doing projects around the house, small things, weeding, trimming the hedges. It doesn't matter. I told one of my students, I said, look, just make your bed, for example. That's just having an effect on your environment. And he came back the next week and he said, well, I made my bed once, but then I didn't do it. And I said, well, it doesn't matter. This is not about establishing a routine of bed making. It's about every day affecting your environment. So if you make your bed one day and then you clean your desk the other day, and then you plant some plants the next day, it's just psychologically you're going to be more well off because you're impacting your environment. And so that impact, I think, allowing it to just be very local, hyper local, is going to be really useful for all of us. And so with parents, to invite their kids into a project and say, hey, like I'm going to be planting a bunch of plants, I could, come help me, and do it in a related way, not as a chore, but in a really like, hey, I'd love to get your help with this, and invite them in, and then, go do something where you're actually at the end of it, you're like, hey, look at that. Those 4 plants are now in the ground, or hey, we cleared that 1 square yard of weeds. Awesome. Little things like that will signal to our brain, hey, yeah, we're still affecting our environment. So that's kind of, if I come back to the 3 needs, there's, relatedness, autonomy, and competence or effectiveness. And a simpler way to remember them is that there's like self, other, and world,
Mm.
right? And so we have to attend to our relationships with ourselves and say, am I kind of living in alignment with my genuine self? Am I and this doesn't just mean like am I like really like expressed in like a artistic way. It's like, am I being more or less true to myself, right? And then there's other, which is the relatedness piece, and it's like, am I connecting with others? What's the quality of my relationships? And then there's the world, and it's like, am I impacting my surroundings? Am I affecting my surroundings? And if we attend to those three areas, our well-being goes up, our motivation goes up, our vitality goes up. And if we do it for ourselves, we're going to be not only setting a good example for our kids, but we're also going to be more available for them. And we can also guide them to do the same.
Liked the idea of inviting parents to be the guide for that for their children, because our kids don't necessarily know. They might feel the impulse to do it, but to even just ask some of those questions, like, because sometimes it's also, I remember when I was first learning about this with you, we talked about video games and how video games often provide kids with those three needs. They get the connection because they're gaming with friends. They feel really good about themselves because they're really affecting their environment, and they're totally autonomous, and they feel like they're, so self-directed. And not only that they are doing it and they like it, but in the game they are self-directed. And so, and then the question is that, okay, well, how can we as parents be making sure that those three needs are being met in their lives? And it could even be things like, I remember that I just made my older son be the person, he was my go-to person about computers. And so he felt like he was the one that knew more. We've kind of created a monster, but it was good because it was like, and I'd go to him and say like, hey, Jake, this is happening. What's going on here? Like, what do I do? And he would feel good about himself that he was the computer person for the house
Yeah.
for,
Yeah.
and so how can parents, not like you said, not so much like you need to do this is a chore, but invite them to see, to take responsibility for some things that might make them feel better about themselves.
Well, there's a useful distinction I'll just add that helps with that communication. And it's like, does the communication appear or is it perceived as controlling, like we were talking about before, or is it perceived as informational?
Mm.
And that distinction, at first I was like, what does it mean to be informational? It's just providing information. So it's like, if you say, if you kind of take away from this, oh yeah, kids need to be sort of making their bed, right? And then you go, hey, I want you to make your bed every day, or dust or clean, then that's going to be controlling. But if you go to them and say, hey, I just learned that one very simple key to increased motivation, well-being, and vitality is that we are affecting our environment in any way. That's informational. And then you say, so I'm trying it out, and I went out and I spent 20 minutes just weeding, and I felt so much better. It was like weird. So I encourage you, if you're feeling kind of like low or kind of in a funk, just do anything to affect your environment, and it'll lead to you feeling better. And you can run it as an experiment and see for
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah.
That's like much more informational, and it kind of sets it up as like more of like, I wonder if that would work. That
Mm.
I don't know, it makes it more like kind of some curiosity come with it. So
Mm.
that's what that's kind of how I would do it.
Good. That's a good reframe, or like, perspective shift on it. Cause I think for me, I have historically come in with something and just been like excited about my new idea and then it falls flat. And so I like the invitation to just be more informational and share my own experience. Um, I think that I want to just have a couple minutes. Do you have a couple minutes to talk about one last thing?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So one thing I think that happens with parents of teenagers is they believe that they don't matter anymore. They believe that, they're very focused maybe in this time of coronavirus on how much their kids are suffering because they don't have socialization, and they're really worried about it. And because they're focused on that, they're missing what's right there in front of them, which is what kids really deeply want. And you mentioned it earlier, is they want to feel supported by, loved, appreciated by, and seen by their parents. And at the core of what they're really needing is that. And yes, it's true. They really do need to be with their friends. There's truth in that. It's not
Especially, yeah, as they get older. Yeah.
There is, it's not that that's not important, but the foundation really is the connection with their parents. And I know that Dr. Gordon Neufeld, in his book, Hold On to Your Kids, that's the whole story, is that our children, even in their high school, teenage years, are ideally parent oriented. They're taking their cues from their parents. They're connected to their parents as their foundation, and their peers are important, but they're not. If they are so oriented around their peers, they've actually, it's actually harder for them. I mean, I'm not going to get into it all right now, but there's so much to be said. I'm like tempering myself from sharing the entire book right now.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, Gordon Neufeld talks about peer orientation, where it's actually a big problem when kids take their cues from their peers rather than from the adults in their lives. And yeah, so in a sense, there's a way in which this whole disruption has kind of a disrupting effect on peer orientation, which is really good. It's not good that they're getting, they're not able to be with their really good friends, although, they can be digitally. But what is good is that they're the sort of subculture of teens, that gets the subculture of school is sort of disrupted, so that kids are going to be more likely to orient back towards their parents more fully, because that's all there is. So I mean, obviously, I mean, so it's a good thing, but I think that well, I was watching, there's a new special on Michael Jordan. It's like a multi-part documentary that just got put out, and he was talking about what motivated him as a young kid. And he was, I think, one of 5 kids, and he was like always wanting his dad's approval. And his dad, Michael had at least a couple of older brothers, and the dad would be like bonding with the older brother over something and being like, "Get out of here, Michael," and he was like so hungry for that he wanted to like excel. I mean, like, that's how strong this force is. Like, when the kids want their parents' approval so much, it will drive them to be, the best basketball player in the history of the game. And if you there's actually on the another example recently, I watched Miss Americana. It's about Taylor Swift, and she starts off saying like she always wanted to be good. She always was hoping for that approval, and that like literally drove her to be this, it's not necessarily the most healthy expression. I mean, she's obviously been wildly successful, so that's good. But for her, but at the same time, that's how hungry she was for that love.
Yeah, it's like you can't argue with the reality that our kids want that. Like,
That's
whether it turns into something that becomes a little more obsessive, or whether it, is in a more healthy form, it doesn't matter. It's just the truth that our kids deeply value what we think of them, even if they act like they don't. Even if they reject us and all of what they do seems like they do not give a, like, flying anything of it, they do,
Yeah.
they do. And so it's an opportunity. It just feels like this is a great place to say, like, hey, yeah, you can focus on feeling bad for your kids for not having their peers, or you can shift it around and see this as like an amazing opportunity to bring more connection
Yeah.
between you and your child.
And I'll
you
just
know
add maybe one thing there. We have such a legacy from the past, from like the 80s and 90s of the importance of self-esteem, that there's a temptation when we think about this, I don't know, for not for everyone, but probably for many, to say, oh, okay, I haven't been kind of like connecting with my kid as much as I'd like to, so I'm going to go in and do it. And so we kind of think about going in to boost their self-esteem, just going like, you're great. I think you're a really great kid. Now, some of that could work, but sometimes kids just brush it off. They're like, okay, mom, that's, you're a parent, you're supposed to say that. So, okay, whatever. And then the other one is like, it's sort of complimenting them. And that doesn't quite, it sort of maybe even makes them feel good about, oh, wow, you think I'm good at this. But it's like, what they really want is to feel important to you.
Mm.
It's a more interpersonal thing. It's like, so instead of saying you're great at this, I think for littler kids it can be good to, or actually for any age kid, there's a lot here, I'm trying to squeeze it in. For any age kid, if they do something and they really do it well, to like acknowledge that and go, wow, nice job on that. That's one thing. But to just sort of generally go, kind of give them an ego boost is less helpful than saying, you know what, you matter so much to me. I care so much about you.
Mm. Yeah.
I mean, it's like every time I do that, I love it, because every time I do that, I like, my heart warms. I'm like, it's like
Me too.
it's a complete just hypothetical. There's no kid, there's no parent. I'm just like, hey, you know what? You matter to me. It's like,
Mm.
like those words just really resonate, right? Because it's person to person. It's not that you're just objectively great. It's like you subjectively matter.
Mm.
That's the
Mm.
difference.
That is such a beautiful thing for people to hold on to, as something to say to their kids and or anyone.
I'm so glad we get this time together.
Yeah.
I'm so glad we get this. There's a lot of stressful things about this, but I'm so glad we get all this time together. I'm really
Yeah.
cherishing it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's pretty beautiful. I know
It's
it.
kind of simple. It's kind of simple, and it's like those. It doesn't take a long time to say that, but that will make such a positive impact on the relationship and on the well-being of the kid. It's like, oh, I mean, you don't have to go into kind of like even saying for the kid, you don't have to say, hey, I know this is a really stressful time, but if we change how we're thinking about it, we can see some positives in it. Like
Mm.
that's a fine thing to do, but that's talking more of a cognitive thing. And we want to communicate on a more emotional level and just say, I'm so glad, there's been a lot, I think, being honest, there's been a lot of hard things about this for me. I know for you too. I know you're missing your friends, and I am too, but I'm so glad we get this time together.
Mm.
I couldn't imagine anything better.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because, yeah, but it's true. And I think most of the parents actually do feel that way, even though they might not feel that way in moment to moment interactions with their kids. It's what they really, I know so many parents of teens who are really deeply grateful to have this time, but
Yeah.
they're also, some of them are also experiencing a lot of conflict at the same time. So it is a little bit of like
You can,
they want
and
both.
that one, that sort of same sentiment can be focused on that. Hey, I know we've been like butting heads a lot because we're all under so much pressure, but the reality is I'm so grateful
Mm.
to get this time with you.
Mm. Yeah. It's really holding both to be true. So then the kid also is like, what are you talking about? We've been fighting the whole time.
Yeah.
You get a chance to hold the reality of the situation and also the reality of your heart. Yeah. Well, so I think you do that so well. And I know that the kids love that that you bring that to them, that and you've shared so many examples of that over the time that I've known you, that I know that this is just, and I just know it's who you are. And I also just want to emphasize something. It's not just you. Your mentors are really amazing. Your tutors are really amazing. You spend so much time working with them to get them to understand these concepts as well and to embody them so that they're bringing that to the students that they work with. That I think that's just something to call out that is important
That's a
to
great
note.
point. I'm so fortunate to have such a great team of people all doing the same work and doing it in their own way, and bonding with kids. And it's kids find their favorite, and then it's like they're just like so locked in, and I'm like, good, you guys go,
Yeah.
so yeah, so it's great. I'm really grateful I feel very fortunate to have such a great team of people.
Yeah. So parents can work with you one-on-one as well. They
True.
can if they
Yeah.
want to. They can also, especially if if you're working with their kids, sometimes there's real value in you working with the parents to help them to be bringing some of these essential items to their home.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I've done it in all different ways. Sometimes I just work with the parents.
oh, okay, good.
Sometimes I just work with the kids, of course, and then sometimes I work with both
Mhm.
separately, and then sometimes I work with both, where
Together.
I'll work with the parents, I'll work with the kids, then we'll all meet together. So there's a wide range. It's really what the family and what the students' needs
Yeah.
are. Yeah.
Great. So the best way for people to find you is on your website. Is that right? On
Yeah, yeah.
lifeworks.life? Is it lifeworks.life?
LifeWorks.life.
Great, great. And yeah, and is there anything else before we wrap up that you'd like to share about what you do, or what else, anything we missed? Besides a million things that we missed, but anything really important for today that we missed?
Um, I mean, I feel like we covered a lot of good stuff, and I think, I guess I would just say, if parents are feeling like they're concerned about their kids, or they're needing help, or getting, just figuring it out and making sense of anything, to reach out, and we can have an initial check-in, and see if I can offer some simple advice to help them kind of chart a new course, or if it might make sense to actually work together, and whether that means working with, like I was just saying, with the student or with the parent or with both.
Yeah, that's great. Because I think right now, having that consultation would be really helpful for people to just know, is this really a problem? Like, is this something that I really do need to be concerned about? What are the types of things that we could be putting in place? So that's good. And I know a lot of parents who don't want to be in the business of haranguing their kids and doing all the things that they think they have to do, and having somebody like you and your team on their side would be really helpful.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah. That's great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jay.
Yeah.
It's been
Thank
great
you.
talking to you.
For sure. Yeah. It
All
sure has.
right.
Yeah.
Great. And for anybody who would be interested in hearing more from me and the podcasts and YouTube videos that I put out, click subscribe. And also, if you like the video, make sure you click like as well, because it helps us to feel good about ourselves. And also, and even more importantly, it gets this video out there more, so more people get benefits from the content. So thank you so much. Thank you, Jai. It's been great.